Now what I've seen is people I knew in Sri Lanka as journalists who worked there emerging in London in the last month or two with their families, claiming asylum, they're going abroad. I think dozens of journalists, increasingly Sinhalese journalists, not just Tamil journalists like Nimarajan and many of the others who've already left or stopped working. And I think, I mean, Pearl is obviously right that those who work for the international media have a degree of protection, insurance, equipment, and so on. But you know, to what extent do these Sri Lankan journalists who work for foreign organizations get protected when they stop doing their jobs, when they leave Sri Lanka and they go abroad? You know, do they get a job in London? Do they get reposted somewhere else? This is a big issue. And do the organizations really understand the kind of risks they ran and the effects on them and the fact that they can't go back and they don't know when they can go back? I mean, certainly for their families, it's extremely difficult for them, you know, to cope with the stress of moving. They don't come to London because they think it's better. They come because, you know, they hope that they can stay alive. And many of them have been proved right in retrospect by what's happened to Lasanta. So I think, you know, there is something we can do. We can support those people who are in exile. And we don't even know how many there are and where they've gone, all of them. Many of them have vanished. One thing that struck me was when I went for the first round of peace talks, there were other journalists there covering them in Thailand. And there were journalists who would come up to me from very reputable organizations who would ask me, oh, the Tamil Tigers, they're Muslims, aren't they? You know, because the idea, I suppose, in their mind was terrorist, Muslim, etc. And you'd have to explain, and you'd try and explain the kind of complicated politics of Sri Lanka in sort of 20 minutes before breakfast. It was impossible. So there is a lot of lack of understanding. It is a very complicated story, and sometimes we forget how difficult it is for people outside to follow it and to follow the intricacies of it. At the same time, you know, Sri Lanka doesn't have oil, doesn't have nuclear weapons or nuclear technology, strategically not as significant. You could argue it has some importance, but not as significant as many other countries. And no Muslim terrorists, of course, too.
Not yet.
And so I think that's one of the reasons. And then, of course, for international journalists, a lot of them don't get visas now to go in if they want to cover the war. So it's very difficult for them. If they rely on local stringers, it's extremely dangerous to do that. It's arguably questionable whether you should do that and put them at risk. So, and we've mentioned local stringers, I mean the provincial ones even more, the ones outside Colombo even more at risk. And I think, you know, just to put it in perspective, I think Pearl spoke very nicely about, you know, how painful it is and how difficult it is. But I was in Sri Lanka at arguably the best time, you know, during the 3 years of the peace process and 1 year of war. And it was, you know, relatively free. You could go to the tiger areas, you could move around and so on. But even I had quite a lot of trouble. I mean, I had a lot of, you know, very nasty phone calls, very aggressive emails from people. I mean, in the end, I actually papered my studio walls with very aggressive newspaper articles about me, accusing me of being a terrorist, of being a raw agent, of being everything you can possibly think of. So, you know, the good times, at the best of times, even then it was a very tense, very difficult story to tell, even for someone like me, protected by the BBC and so on. So how much more difficult now for Sri Lankan journalists who say there?
Anybody who's trying to tell the story with the other side, you know, recently the brother of the president gave an interview. He's the defense secretary to the BBC, to Chris Morris, who he said will never ever be allowed into Sri Lanka ever again. He said, you know, there are two groups of people in Sri Lanka who are for the war and who are against it, or who are not for the war. You know, we, just like George Bush said, you know, either you are with us or against us.
What I would like to focus on right now is the condition of civilians, because that's a big question mark. You know, it's come in the course of this discussion in terms of how does the media access the conflict zone. Human Rights Watch was lucky enough to conduct a two-week field trip in the north of the country in January and obtained some very, very sensitive and crucial information which points out as to what exactly is going on in the conflict areas. Our reporting has found out that over 2,000 civilians have been killed since the outset of fighting since January 2009. Over 5,000 civilians have been seriously injured. And these are conservative estimates based on reports by independent monitors, the few that exist, the few humanitarian agencies, the few UN agencies that exist on the ground, and largely on victim testimony. Both sides are conducting gross violations of the rules of war. These include indiscriminate shelling on civilians. The government is doing that apace. It is also shelling areas which are marked as safe zones. It has repeatedly bombed hospitals. The LTTE, on the other hand, has its own sets of atrocities on the civilians it claims to represent. The LTTE has prevented civilians from leaving the conflict areas. It has virtually used civilians as human shields. It has fired on civilians who have tried to flee these areas. We have some very, very moving testimony of parents, mothers, fathers. A father, when he was fleeing the conflict zone with his 4-year-old son, broke his son's arms because he was holding on to him so tight, and he was trying to dodge the shelling that was coming from all sides. Once the few civilians, our approximate number is about 30 to 40,000 civilians have perhaps managed to leave the LTTE areas. Once these civilians come out into the government side and perhaps heave a sigh of relief of being out of the conflict zones, they are then being taken in by the government into what they call welfare centers, but are actually detention camps. And they are heavily militarized. There's presence of military intelligence in these camps. No humanitarian agencies are allowed access to these camps. No media is allowed into these camps. The hospitals actually mirror what is going on in these camps. There are no pain medications, there are no anesthetic drugs, the level of antibiotics, there is absolutely virtually no medical supplies available in these hospitals, and yet the government says that it has enough to take care of people, and they have repeatedly stopped humanitarian convoys from entering the conflict areas, and also prohibited supplies from getting into the hospitals. They have also put pressure on doctors not to talk to humanitarian agencies, not to talk to other people outside to show how bad the conditions are. So in a nutshell, we have a situation where civilians, some 200,000 of them, are trapped in these abysmally shocking conditions, either in the detention centers or within the conflict zones, where they are either taking cover under bunkers, or they're scrambling for their lives in the fields and trying to make it to the other side. As I said before, both sides, not just one, both are committing gross violations of the rules of law, of war, of humanitarian law, and of human rights law.